Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Other Side of Sales. I am Ashley Early.
And I'm Kasey Jones.
And we're doing something, I hate to say a little different, but Kasey went through some pretty serious trauma in early June, I think it was. And you're recently returned to the podcast. So happy you're back. But
Be back.
Yeah, we'd be remiss, I think, if we didn't address what happened to you. And I want to preface this with some things that I've learned in this experience about trauma and how to support trauma survivors. And part of the reason for this episode is to share with you what's willing to be shared, but also to do a little bit of education. Yeah. And one of the things and I want to be clear here too, neither of us is professionals, neither of us has any sort of substantive training in these matters, but we've both made an effort before this and especially now to make sure that we know how to, as friends of Kasey, best support Kasey, and Kasey how best to support herself. And one of the real themes that's come up is, especially when an attack leaves a visible scar, one of the worst things that you can do to a trauma survivor is ask them to relive their trauma. So asking, tell me what happened. I want to hear all the details. How'd you get that scar? This sort of thing. It's fine to ask what happened, but asking for details and stuff like that can basically re-traumatize that person. And this became very clear to me because Kasey did something incredibly brave, which brutal honesty, I know I could not have done. I would not have done. Which was you were on LinkedIn, within 72, 48 hours saying, this happened to me. I'm dealing with it, but I'm not going to be on here for a while. And one of the things I did to keep myself focused and not tearing the walls down, because I wanted to do something to help, was I policed those comments. And 95% of them were you guys just being overwhelmingly supportive and asking how you could help and stuff like that. But there were people who were jumping in and they were either accusatory, saying, oh, you must have done something wrong. Kasey must have done something wrong. They were asking for incredible detail that was deeply personal, that I felt was very much over the line, or they were just basically allowing their curiosity to trump the need for healing. So when I proposed this episode to Kasey, my proposition was basically, let's do an episode where you share whatever you are wanting to share about the attack. And you guys will notice when I ask questions, I'm not going to ask questions. I'm going to ask one question, and then I'm not going to do follow-ups. I'm not going to ask for more detail because this is her control in the situation. She can share whatever she wants, and whatever she doesn't want to share, that's it. The other way I pitched this was that way if anyone decides to be a jerk down the line, she can say, I did a podcast episode, here's a link. And they can just go listen.
So a couple of things. One, in a second, I will explain what happened and I'll go into a fair amount of detail. I will also explain why I did share that on LinkedIn. Because there's a very real reason. And then we can talk a little bit about the things that I've learned about, one, how to help yourself, but also how to help someone else. But I also want to point out, not only were some of those comments leaning in towards curiosity, but there were a few of those comments that also jumped to conclusions and were very accusatory. And don't draw conclusions about what someone else has gone through or the reasoning behind it or the context, because you really don't know. And, I've repeated this so many times, I learned pretty quickly that people have a morbid curiosity about what I went through. And I do have very, very visible scars. And, for good or for bad, because of the age of COVID, I don't go out. And so it makes me very nervous about going out in public because I know people are going to ask questions. And Ashley had pretty much the funniest idea that I'd ever heard, where at one point she was like, all right, she's like, here's what you need to do. She's like, we need to make like business cards for you. So that when someone is like, hey, what happened to you? You can hand it to them. It just has a QR code. Like, if you want to learn more about what happened to me, click this QR code. And then the QR code takes them to a website or something that just says, it's none of your fucking business.
Yeah.
Because,
well, you had health professionals grilling you, which drove me nuts.
And people are, and you saw the comments on LinkedIn, but I cannot even tell you how many comments, how many direct messages I got from strangers asking me very, very, very specific, pointed questions that are shocking.
Yeah.
So let's take a step back and I'll just explain what happened.
So Kasey, what happened?
So I have 2 dogs. I have my dog, Machin, who I've had for 5 years now. She is, as James Buckley loves to remind me, I once referred to her as my ride or die bitch. She has been with me through a million things. And then 2 years ago, a friend of my boyfriend asked us to take care of her rescue dog, Pillsbury. And we were supposed to take care of Pillsbury for 2 weeks, and we had him for 2 years. And Pillsbury had a really, really troubled puppy childhood. He was used as a bait dog for fighting rings. So he had some issues, and he had never shown aggression towards my boyfriend, Andy, or me, but he had attacked my dog several times. And, one afternoon, Andy was out and my dog started barking, and I could just tell that Pillsbury was going to attack her. So I got my dog and I ran to the back door and I got her out the back door. And for the first time ever, I think he was so amped up and so ready to attack her that he just kind of took one look at me and he was like, "You'll do." And so he attacked me. And I fought him off. I got him off multiple times and he would just come right back. He mainly went after my arms, but he bit me at the center of my chest. He bit the side of my face and my ear. I have a long wound at the base of my chin. I did everything I could to fight him off. I hit him over the head with a wine bottle 3 separate times, and it just did not faze him at all. And it reached this point where I realized I was not going to be able to do this on my own. And I managed to get the side door to my house open, and I started screaming for help. And thank God for the pandemic. Thank God for my neighbors. But they heard my screams. And one of my neighbors ran to the end of my driveway, saw what was happening, and then she ran to go get her husband. And at this point, I started getting really lightheaded. And so I genuinely thought I was going to die. I thought I've lost enough blood, I'm going to die. So there's a chunk of time where I have no memory. And I thought for a while that maybe I'd passed out. I have learned since that no, I did not pass out, but I do not remember it at all. And so I remember—
Which is not uncommon for trauma.
Mm-hmm. I remember seeing Annette, my neighbor, at the end of my driveway, and there was another woman who was like walking down the street, and the two of them are at the end of my driveway. Annette takes one look at me. She starts running. I remember this. And I remember the other woman at the end of the driveway saying, "I'm calling 911. You're not going to die." The next thing I remember is I am lying on the side steps of my house. Annette's husband, Scott, we have this like gravel pile at the end of the driveway because we've done a bunch of work to the backyard. And he is sitting on the gravel pile holding Pillsbury, like bear hugging him. Pillsbury is completely covered in my blood. And I am lying there. My arms are totally open. I'm covered in blood and tissue. And my neighbor from across the street, Sandy, is sitting in the doorway next to me, holding my hand, keeping me calm. And I just remember just saying over and over again, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. Eventually the ambulance gets there. And also in our driveway, sort of in front of where Scott is holding Pillsbury, is my boyfriend Andy has a, what is it? It's a 1989 Volkswagen van. So there's this like big thing in between the end of the driveway and where we all are. And the paramedics get there, the firefighters get there, and they realize that the dog is back with me and they will not come and get me. And I told Sandy the other day, I genuinely think it is because of her keeping me calm. They said, you know, they're like, we're not coming down there. Scott is pissed and yelling at them. And I remember being like, I got this. I can do this. And so I stand up. I make it to the end of the driveway where the paramedics are, and I passed out in their arms. And they got me in the ambulance. They took me to the emergency room. I have never experienced pain like this. I can't even begin to describe how painful it was. And we spent the next, I think it was 6 or 7 hours in the emergency room. Easily anywhere from like 8 to 15 people in the room with me. They had to take x-rays of every single part of my body that had been bitten, so that they could understand how extensive the damage was. They told me later that I am a sort of a rare type of person that fentanyl does not work for me.
Oh no.
Yeah. So they'd given me a ton of fentanyl and it did nothing. Like it just did nothing at all for me. And I kept being like, what? I just thought they'd just put me out. Right? Like, why do I have to be awake for this? And they were like, no, we can't do that. Like, we can't put you out for various reasons. One, I had eaten right before it happened. So they couldn't put me out for surgery. So I didn't have surgery so this happened at like 4:00 in the afternoon. I didn't have surgery until almost noon the next day. They also can't, because my parents weren't there and Andy, my boyfriend, does not have power of attorney, I had to consent to surgery. And so they can't
consent while you're on opioids.
Well, you can, but you have to be up and coherent. You can't be out, and they have to know what you're consenting to. So they had to x-ray everything. They had to do more discovery to figure out what surgery I needed before I could actually consent to it.
Great.
So yeah, they wound up giving me ketamine 3 separate times, which it's basically having like just a total out of body experience so that I can detach from what's going on. They wound up figuring out that Dilaudid, which is another opiate, actually did work for me. And so they started.
And Dilaudid's what they use to stop seizures as well too.
I think so.
Yeah.
And it's much more of like an old school opiate. But I mean, this is hours of me being in there before they start to get the pain under control. At this point, they bring in plastic surgeons to stitch up my face and fix my ear. And the orthopedic surgeon, he comes in and he said, look, so I have a genetic degenerative neurological disease. I don't have a very severe version of it, but what happens is the nerves that feed the muscles in my extremities, my hands, my feet, my wrists, my ankles, start to kind of die over time. And so as a result, like I interpret a lot of pain in very, very different ways from normal people. And the orthopedic surgeon, I told him this, and he could tell, he was familiar enough with this disease. He could tell by this sort of shape of my feet, like how progressed it was. And at one point he comes in and he said, look, he said, no one else thinks I should do this. They don't think you can handle it. But he was like, I've seen how you've reacted to things. I've seen how the pain is getting under control. And he was like, I think they're wrong. And I think that you're in a strong enough position where we can clean out your wounds now. We can close them up. And he's like, we'll reopen them and we'll clean them even more deeply when you're in surgery. But this way you'll be safer, more comfortable through the night. And he was like, we're going to start this. And he was like, if you can't handle it, we'll stop. He was like, but my gut tells me you can. And he was right. I'm not going to, it was extraordinarily painful. They had to do these things where, I forget what they call it, but they do this thing where they test to see if your joints have been like compromised. So they push fluid into your joint and then they pull it out and see sort of like what comes out. My left elbow was fine, super painful for them pushing that fluid in, but they pulled it out. My left elbow was fine. My right was not. So they wind up basically pushing fluid in and pulling it out. Like, and I mean, like, we're talking a syringe that's God, 8 inches. Sorry we should include a trigger warning here for all of this, but they do that. They clean up my arms. Oh, by the way, how I consented to this is they put a pen in between my toes and moved a piece of paper underneath it. That's how I signed consent to surgery. They didn't have a hospital room for me that night, so I stayed in the ER that night. I wound up being very lucky because that the next day when I had surgery was the very first day that this hospital had changed their rules and allowed trauma patients to have visitors. So my boyfriend came, and I was doing pretty well after surgery. I remember falling asleep at like maybe 10 o'clock that night. And when you're in the hospital, they come into your room all the time. So at about 1 o'clock in the morning, they came in to give me more medication to check on things. And I could not go back to sleep. And I could not stop crying. And I remember having this like aha moment Thursday night that I did not want to talk to anybody about what I was going through. I did not want to communicate with anyone. I wanted to crawl into a hole and just retreat from the world. And somehow I knew that this is not what I needed, and that I needed to force myself, to push myself to be in communication with people, to talk with people, and to share. And I knew that every day that I waited to talk to people about what I was going through, it would become exponentially harder. And so that next morning, that's when I texted you. It's when I texted a couple of friends, and you know, I couldn't type. My finger was broken. I mean, his tooth went so deep in my arm that his tooth punctured my bone in 2 separate places, my thumb and my elbow. And so I really didn't want to, but I reached out to a few people that I knew would be there for me, that would support me. And I posted something on LinkedIn so that I could just kind of put it out in the world of like, I'm going through this. Give me a breather. Because I also was thinking about my 2 employees and the fact that, you know, we had struggled because of the pandemic, and I didn't want to be put in a position where I had to lay them off because of something I'd gone through. And what I realized is that doing that was like the smartest thing that I did, because it gave people enough information where they could come to my aid and they could help me. And I could do that in a way that was, I don't know, not me asking specifically. And I mean, here's the thing, so anybody that knows me knows I'm really, 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 really bad at asking for help. And I really didn't have a choice this time. And the way you and a few other really key people supported me and made it so clear that I was not alone, that I would not go through this alone. I can't even begin to tell you what that meant to me, what that did for me. It means more than I can ever begin to say. And it was just this reminder of all that is kind of beautiful about life and about humanity. So thank you.
Those of you who are not watching video, I promise you just against it because we're both crying like fools.
I'm sure they can tell.
I mean, there's details there you haven't shared with me, and I hadn't heard this phrase before until you started going through this. And it was this idea that allowing someone to help you is a gift to the other person. And there were a few points along the way where you mentioned, okay, you're the first to hear, you're the first to see. I cannot think of another experience in my life where someone's trusted me like that. That wasn't like a family member who, you know, you don't have a choice. That meant a lot, and it gave me purpose and meaning, and it gave me something to do, even though I couldn't do anything because I was on the other side of the country.
But you did so much. You did so much, and
I would have given it all if I could have come to that hospital and just given you a hug, or like thrown a sticky finger at the window or something to make you laugh, or something physical.
I know.
I mean, especially in COVID, because we're all craving that contact. But it has been. I'm with you, that reminder. If we actually opened this up talking about all the comments, some of the comments that were really kind of terrible, but the vast majority of them were people just coming out of the woodwork saying how much they adore you and asking me how they could help and all this other stuff. And you said, I have to share this story because the first time we talked, and it was audio because you couldn't type. One of the first things you said was, you know, I think we can make this good for the podcast. I'm not kidding. I have evidence of this. One of the first things you said, and I'm typing back at you trying to work during the day, and I'm like, what the fuck are you doing even thinking about the podcast right now? And you're like, I just need something to think about on this. I'm like, okay, that's what you want. We can do that. But that cracked me up. It still cracks me up.
Well, and that's the thing that's so interesting about it is like, you also like, I think we all know this, but it's so different when you're going through it. Like you go through these crazy waves where it was like, okay, it was that Friday I connected with you and I posted that thing on LinkedIn. I connected with a bunch of people and then I did not respond to a single text message for like 3 days.
Yeah.
I went home and that Friday, they came into my room in the hospital and they said, we think they're going to let you go home. And I said, I can't go home. And, I convinced them to let me stay another day because it was so overwhelming. And then so I went through these like really big ups and downs of I'd have a couple of good days and then I'd have days where it's like I could barely function. I could do nothing but cry. Because here's the thing, it's like, yeah, emotionally super traumatic, but I also, I couldn't I couldn't straighten my arms until like 2 weeks ago.
So 6-8 weeks.
Yeah.
If not
And
more.
3 weeks ago, I had the nurse practitioner in the orthopedic surgeon's office be like, oh yeah, it's totally likely you'll never straighten your arm again. And I was like, okay.
Thanks for just dropping that into conversation.
Yeah. And I throughout the entire thing, it's, and I think COVID is like this. I think the George Floyd protests are like this, where you see the absolute best of humanity and the absolute worst.
Yes.
And I really focus on the former, not the latter.
Don't deny the latter exists.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I have some neighbors who literally saved my life. And I found out afterwards that I had one neighbor that watched the whole thing through his window and didn't do anything. Didn't call 911, didn't come to help, nothing.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm squinting my eyes very tightly right now.
Yeah. And like talked about it with the neighbor that saved my life, kind of like, a story at a cocktail party. And
yeah, because you're clearly an anecdote.
Yeah. And then I think the biggest thing that I think was really hard for me to adjust to, and it still is tough. I've gotten much better at it. I'm nervous about when I go out in public more, is people's morbid curiosity. And so I can't tell you how many direct messages I got on social media. 2 questions. What kind of dog is it? And what did you do?
Yep.
What did you do to make him do this?
I don't know if you know this. In the day or so this happened kind of on a Wednesday. I did not know. So I'm blowing up your phone and your email on Thursday because I was trying to record a podcast episode. And then Nikki reaches out to me. She's like, hey, heads up, this thing happened. So my first reaction is, fuck. A, Kasey. B, I've been blowing up her phone all day with bullshit. I know, nobody knew, but it was fine. So when you reached out the next day, it was like, I didn't sleep very well that night. I had in my head, you were either literally on death's doorstep or you just had a big, you just had a bite mark on your arm. I could not tell which it was.
Oh yeah.
Because I didn't know and Nikki didn't know anything either. So when you reached out the next day, it was this huge relief and at the same time horror of what it was. And I think I actually asked you at one point, I was like, I don't know how that group, but there's a group text that I am now on with several of your friends who are now my friends in Portland. And the 4 or 5 of us were all just kind of testing each other, brainstorming how to support you because we were all just felt so helpless.
Yeah.
And that was really powerful because it meant that we could, it helped me feel like, oh God, I don't have to figure it out on my own from across the country. She has local friends. I don't have to, because my instinct is jump in and fix everything, which is completely unrealistic and not healthy, but it is. And it was a great way for us to be like, okay, because like I said, you completely rightfully took a step back and you had said to me, I need to make sure, don't let me crawl into a hole.
Yeah.
Like, okay, space is good, but I'm not going to let you go down to the hole. But this group, it was nice because we were able to, without all of us checking on you.
Yeah.
Hey, I heard from Kasey this morning. Okay, everyone else leaves you alone.
Yeah.
Then the evening. Okay, somebody else heard from her. Okay, good. And if we were sending you stuff, it was like stuff that we were really hoping would just make you laugh because
Yeah.
what the hell else are you going to do? But that was so smart and of you to connect us. And it helped, I think.
And I don't even
remember
I don't even remember.
I think I might have asked like in the context of like food or something. I was like, I want to send you food. Where can I ask? And you're like, talk to so-and-so.
Yeah. And they, I mean, it's like, I got weekly grocery deliveries for a month, which like made such a huge difference because it was also, you know, I'm in pain. I have a super restrictive diet because of other health reasons, but
which was our first thought. We're like, oh God, her diet. What is she gonna do?
Well, and like little things where it's like, you know, I couldn't use my hands. Like I could use my left hand, but I couldn't use my right hand. So you can still kind of see it, but like my thumb is split horizontally down the middle. And so super, super tender, and this thumb was broken. So it was like, I couldn't do really basic things. I had, you know.
This is your right thumb. So typing like you would
right
on your phone or doing.
I couldn't type for a solid month.
Yeah.
I also have several stitches on the palm of my hand. So I couldn't even straighten my fingers really. And my arms were like bandaged and like, you know, folded basically. So I couldn't even like this is my water bottle from the hospital because I couldn't drink from a cup because I couldn't get my hand close enough to my mouth to be able. So even when I took medication, like the nurses and Andy had to like put pills in my mouth because I couldn't get them. You know, so like the most basic things.
Things you take for granted.
Things you take for granted. And I think the other thing that was really that I would not have this just wouldn't have occurred to me had I not gone through it is so between all the George Floyd protests and what I had been through, I don't want to watch freaking cop shows. And guess what? 90% of what is on TV is like reruns of Law and Order and CSI. So I'm in the hospital. I couldn't watch TV because it was all sports, which I don't give a shit about, and cop shows. And sports weren't even going on. It
wasn't even sports. It was reruns of sports from 5 years ago.
So like people talking about sports, which is like, oh, Jesus.
Even worse.
Yeah. And so it really like even just finding things to watch, even when I got home, it was so difficult. And even like, you know, I got to a period where I was like, okay, I just want silly movies. And so I went down this rabbit hole of like silly movies that were on Netflix. And I started I'd watched a bunch of these really dumb movies. And then I started watching that Andy Samberg movie, Pop Star, Never Stop Stopping or something like. It's like a super stupid movie where he's like Justin Bieber or whatever.
God.
So there's a scene in it and it's silly and it was perfect, right? Yeah. And I'm watching it and then there's a scene in it where his album does terribly, so he needs to like spin the news about him. So he decides he's going to propose to his girlfriend. And there's the scene, you see him like walking her through all these flowers and she's got a blindfold on and they get to the end of the thing with the flowers. And you see 6 men with wolves. And she's like, oh, wolves. And I'm sitting there with my boyfriend and I'm like, oh my God, there's going to be a dog attack. And he was like, oh my God, and like changes the channel. And it's like, I'm watching like the stupidest movie ever. And I realize like, this is going to be like the most disturbing, triggering thing. So it was like, things that would upset me would come out of nowhere, like out of nowhere, stuff like it just wouldn't even occur to you.
Yeah.
And like, that's the thing that I think is so hard to understand about trauma. The stuff that triggers you, and I mean trigger, like it is like it just happens. It puts you right back to where you were, and you cannot see it coming. And it just, all of a sudden, it's like 0 to 60. Your brain is not your own anymore. And it comes out of nowhere. And it's one of the most disempowering feelings, because you feel so out of control. And I know people get that. And that's the questions of like, oh, what kind of dog was it? What did you do? I know you're just curious, but that's what those questions do to people.
Yeah. I have some trauma in my past that has triggered flashbacks.
Yes.
At random. So the disempowerment really is the thing. And I was experiencing this when I was 15, 16. So it took it happening a couple times for me to actually explain what was going on. And it is horrifying at a level you can't understand. Like, I love the phrase, way you put that. It's like, your mind is not your own. I'm very, very, very lucky that I had supportive people. I got help that I needed. And what's strange is those flashbacks were far more damaging than the trauma itself.
Yeah.
The trauma itself I had handled.
Yeah.
The flashbacks took way longer to get under control and to feel normal again.
That's the thing, is those flashbacks make you feel like your life is never going to be your own again. And so for the first 6 weeks, at least, I'd say, sleep was really, really, really hard for me, because I'm not somebody that has nightmares. What would happen, the way my brain interprets those kinds of things, is I'll close my eyes and I will be right back in it. And I won't go into detail, but it was like there was one image, one moment that I would close my eyes and I would be right back there. And that's why that night, like, I couldn't sleep, because every time I closed my eyes, that's what would happen. And so I was on, they put me on pretty intensive medication.
And you're not someone who takes medication lightly either. I'm a total pill popper. You give me a pill, I'm good. Drug me up, no problem. You're very much someone who not avoids it, like you'll do what the doctors tell you, but you're very good about making sure if there's another more holistic way that works better with your system, you'll find it. So
yeah,
when you're saying they're giving you pills and you're taking them, like that's a much bigger deal than it would be like if I was like, oh yeah, they gave me sleeping pills. I'd be like, oh yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Well, and the big thing too is like, they wouldn't give me regular sleeping pills. They gave me these like old school kinds of antidepressants that make you super tired. Mm-hmm. So that's the other thing that was super challenging, is I couldn't sleep less than like 9.5 hours for the first 6 weeks. And so it was like this balance of like, okay, yes, I need this rest, but I'm also trying to get back to normal. And like, how do I do that? And I mean, this shit takes time. And it's like, I feel very lucky. I was already in therapy. We moved it up from once a week to twice a week. And, in therapy last week, I joked because I got on our like little telehealth call thinking, I'm in a really good mood. Things are really good. Like, I don't even feel like I need to have this. And it was like 5 minutes in and I'm sobbing. Because I think the other thing that's really hard about trauma is your trauma isn't your own. It is yours, but other people share in it. And one of the things that's been very challenging, and I shouldn't say it it's not in a bad way, but it's
reality.
There's layers to it, is, I'm going to cry watching my mother or listening to my mother talk about what the experience is like for her, that her daughter is now covered in scars. And I know that the first time I see my parents, my parents are older, they're in their 70s. And so it's like with COVID and everything happening, like they can't just fly out and be with me through all of this.
So your mom did come out for a little bit.
No.
Oh, she didn't? Oh, I thought she had.
No. And honestly, I love my mother dearly, but my mother's also, she's a lot. And so
as someone whose mother is also a lot, yes.
Yeah, it's like I didn't really need her to be like, in my house being upset that my house isn't clean enough and things like that. So it's fine, but I know that the first time that she sees my arms, it's going to be really hard on both of us. And so I think there's also this, like, it's helpful that I'm not going through it alone, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. But there's layers to processing it because other people have their own experience with it. And, it's like, my boyfriend, Andy, like what he's had to go through with this, like he loved that dog. And we had that dog because of him. And so he's dealt with a lot of trauma and loss and guilt and all these other things associated with it, where it's all the layers of the onion of trauma. And I think a lot of people just don't, if you haven't been through it and you haven't been kind of with someone going through it, it's really hard to understand how complex it is and how long it can go on. And one of the things I do want to point out, like, yes, don't ask questions that make someone relive it. Don't ask questions that minimize someone's experience or that makes it seem like you're treating them as a freak show.
Yes.
But also, don't act like nothing happened. Because when I started to get back to work, I didn't have a lot of these, but I had a few conversations where it'd be like my first call back with a client and they would act like nothing happened. And that is disturbing. You don't have to ask me specific questions, but even just something like, hey, how are you today?
Glad you're back. Do you need anything?
Back. Yes. We've been wishing you well. Like anything like that, it can be super minor. You don't have to go into detail. You don't have to say things you're uncomfortable with. But you have to make it clear that you're not ignoring that someone went through something. Because when you do that, it is fucking insulting.
Acknowledging what happened is important without diminishing it.
Yeah.
I think kind of we're moving into the kind of the how to support someone who's going through this, because the sad fact is everyone will likely at some point have to either go through some severe trauma or support someone who they love dearly who's going through something, whether it's an attack, a death. Like even this past week, I found out that one of my clients, actually literally someone that I trained, died unexpectedly.
Yeah.
Mid-20s. Trauma is a fact of life, especially in 2020. And one of the words of the year is empathy. And I hope that we can learn to apply that, but kind of moving into some practical stuff here.
Yeah.
It's the acknowledging it without diminishing. So I think one of the things that you told me was really helpful was, I think I asked you what you wanted and said, you don't even have to tell me. I'm just going to keep checking in on you.
Yeah.
You told me it was helpful to, I'm trying to think how to put this, but like, like not asking details. I just kind of let you tell me when you were ready to tell me. I asked kind of the basics around like, are you okay? Which was a stupid question, but kind of the are you okay side of it. And then everything kind of whatever you're willing to share. And I think that's the thing I'd say people who are supporting people understand that everything that is told to you about the trauma experience is someone choosing to share a piece of their soul.
Yeah.
Even minor details that they're choosing to share is, I mean, let's be honest, I mentioned my own trauma. I'm not telling you what that is. No, I'm not doing that. And I won't. But if someone's willing to tell you anything, that's a gift.
Yes.
That doesn't mean you get to ask more. That doesn't mean you have permission to dive in and ask for more detail.
And I think that's so spot on. And it's knowing that those aren't all the details.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what was so frustrating. And like, I ignored it for the most part, but some of the comments to that post is that people started to draw these conclusions based on like, I didn't go into detail. I said, hey, here's kind of the high level of what I'm going through. And here's my other dog. And I get it that that's like such a human nature of like, we make patterns, we draw conclusions on our own, but you don't know. And I think that was the other thing is like, to your point where you were like, I don't know if you're on death's door or if you just have a bite. And I think oftentimes, I would talk to people where it was very clear that they thought like, oh, I got bit by a dog.
Yeah, there were a couple people in the post who were like, I got bit by a dog. Hit me up if you want to chat. I'm like,
it was like,
I think that's what I was trying to say earlier. I was trying to mention this girl group text that I got on. I was jumping in and calling out texts so we could all go in and upvote everything around us. We could bury those texts. And there were several people who, myself included, because I knew it would look bad if I was just the only one jumping in and defending. So there was like a whole fleet of like 8 of us by the end of the day. I don't know if you know this. It was like literally 8 people. We were all watching those comments like hawks. So if we saw shit like that, we could jump in and tell them to fuck off.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that. And I really appreciate it because that was the big thing is people just assumed that it was like, that it was much more minor than it was.
Well, and I'll say this, I don't know if you remember this, you called me after it had gone live and you started to, I was really hoping you wouldn't see the comments for a few days.
Yeah.
You did. And you called me, you were really concerned. You were like, oh God, what are people thinking about me? How are whatever XYZ. I think you in a moment thought that people were jumping to those conclusions that I don't even know what exactly you were scared of.
Well, there was one person who we then looked at their LinkedIn profile and their LinkedIn profile was like insane and full of conspiracy theories.
Oh yeah.
But there was someone who said that I deserved it because they knew that when animal control came, that the dog was super malnourished and had been abused. And then there was a woman who was like, I don't know, she had I think a director level title at Amazon, who then just went on and on and on about what a horrible person I am and what an awful pet owner and how dare I and all these other things.
This clearly had to have been your fault.
Yeah.
Which it wasn't.
And that I was clearly an abusive pet owner. And it was like, well, first of all, you're basically someone who like, no, like that did not happen. That person just made something up and you ran with it. And that was what kind of concerned me, is it was like, because a bunch of people were responding to this woman from Amazon, and she just kept being like fighting with them about how I was clearly a really bad person and I was abusive and like all this other stuff, and how how someone should call like the animal.
You should be reported. You should be arrested. Yeah. This person is blocked.
Yeah.
Although there's a part of me now, I'm like, I kind of want to send her this episode now just so she can hear the impact and maybe learn something. Because I'll say this too, I don't think I told you about this. I reached out to one of the people who made a comment that I felt pretty insensitive. And I reached out and I was like, hey, heads up, whenever you're dealing with trauma survivors, asking questions like that can be really harmful. It can re-trigger. And in this case, I said, you're actually doing a bit of victim shaming. And he responded back immediately, was a super apologetic, went in and edited the comment, asked me to apologize to you. Like, I honestly didn't know. Thank you for telling me. I will think this stuff in mind going forward.
That's good.
You know, and is still connected with me and on my feed. And it's this whole idea of leading with empathy.
Yeah.
It really, as a dog owner, as a human, as your friend, you don't wish this on anybody.
No.
Like, I don't care how riled up or how much you don't like someone, you don't wish attacks like this on anybody. And sometimes shit just happens and you won't know why. And it's none of our business to know why. And you don't even know why in some cases. It doesn't matter. What matters is helping our fellow human recover, become, and I love it. There's two phrases that are really powerful in situations like this. One is survivor, not victim.
Yeah.
You survived this, and you survived this, I gotta say, with a hell of a lot of grace, and you bounced back. I don't think you realize we were all ready for you to be out for like 3 months.
Yeah.
We were all ready for you just to be, it's August and this happened in June. I was fully braced for you being out for a bit longer. And I know a lot of other people were too. And then all of a sudden you're 3-4 weeks in, you're starting to work again. And we're all like, you sure?
Well, and it was like, you know, I did that too soon. And I wound up doing a little bit too much and having to take steps back. But I will really say it's like there are two things that made, and I felt this, everybody felt this, where it was like, oh my God, I'm doing so much better than any of us expected.
Yeah.
And it is one, because so that same night when I was like, I need to talk about it and I need help, I made a voice message for my therapist and told him everything that happened. And really quickly I was like, I don't know what I need, but I need help. And between doing that and the amazing support of you and of people like you, that's it. I mean, that's what got me through. And it's also, I think, being willing to recognize when, not trying to power through it, but understand when I was getting triggered with things and why and how I could deal with it.
And giving yourself grace to deal with it, not shoulding or blaming and, I should be able to handle this.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll say this too. One of the things that stuck out for me is earlier on, you said, I think one of the reasons I'm doing this as well as I was you had a therapist. You
Yes.
were actively as just maintenance. Yes. It wasn't like you were working through something specifically.
Started with my divorce and then just went on.
Yeah. You had the toolkit there. Yes. To reach out to. And it's one of the things, I started up therapy again recently, and not too long before this. And I told my therapist, like, I think the Monday or Tuesday after I was working through this with her, and I told her, it's like, I need to be in here. It's kind of horrible and morbid, but like in case of dog attack, because I need to know that my brain and myself is strong enough and secure enough so that when the shit hits the fan, I can bounce back as well as Kasey did.
Well, and here's the big thing. And I think you're super smart with that. Like, I'm so grateful that I had that, but it's being in therapy really consistently for years and through not super hard times that's how I recognized what I knew my instinct was to do and why I knew that was not a smart move.
Yeah.
And the other thing that has been very, very helpful is when you're in there, and it takes a long time to get to this point in therapy, but when you're in therapy for a long time, you get much, much better at being curious about your own reactions to things, so that you can take a step back and be like, oh, that's interesting. I reacted like this to that. What does that mean? What is this bringing up for me? And so for me, like, I'll give you an example. Maybe a month ago, my boyfriend and I watched the movie Syriana. Okay.
Oh God, yeah.
It's a movie from like 2007.
George Clooney,
Matt Damon, Iraq. There is a
Academy
scene,
Awards, yeah.
it's a great movie. There's a scene in it in the beginning where Matt Damon and Amanda Peet, their son, gets electrocuted in a pool.
Ooh.
And she's screaming for an ambulance. That scene of watching her scream for help for an ambulance absolutely slayed me. And it makes sense why it did, but it made it so much easier for me to like, okay, I got really upset in the moment. And then I was like, oh, interesting. Okay, what exactly is it about that? Like, so that I could really think through why I was reacting in the way that I was, and think through how I could understand it. And now it's like, if I saw something similar, I wouldn't have that reaction. So and I'll send, we can include it in the show notes, and I'll send you, Ashley, this link, because I think you'd really like this. There's a phenomenal podcast called On Being with Krista Tippett. She talks kind of about the philosophy of life and all these other things. And she interviews this guy, Bessel van der Kolk, who is basically like the expert on trauma. And he talks about how that language that I was using of like, your body and your mind are not your own. I got that from him, where he talks about what is so powerful and so challenging about trauma is that afterwards you can be victim to the world, where you're going about your everyday and you see something or someone says something or something happens, and all of a sudden you are back in it and there's nothing you can do. And he talks about how the way you really survive trauma is you figure out that process. You figure out how to own yourself enough to where when those things happen, you can detach for a moment and observe how you're reacting and not get swept up in it. And it's being in therapy consistently that makes it much easier for you to be able to do that.
Well, and even hearing that makes more sense why service dogs are so important for PTSD, because they can physically, and I've heard about this, they can be trained to sense a panic attack coming on, or sense a trigger, or even potentially react to triggers simultaneously with you, and physically jump to knock you back into that retrospective process.
Yeah. It connects you to something else rather than being swept up in the moment. And I think that's the hardest part is about going through it, is holding on to your sense of self and not getting lost in it all. And therapy, a strong sense of self, and a fucking community, like those are the things that will get you through. So yeah, build those things, work on those things before the trauma happens, so that if it does, you can bounce back.
Kasey, thank you for sharing all of this. I don't think either of us quite expected it to be this much. This turned into another therapy session for both of us, I think, because I don't think we haven't talked about the process retrospectively either.
No.
And I think the last thing I'll say quick, as I said, we haven't talked about this process retrospectively. This is not done.
No.
This is not something that has a definitive end date.
No.
So
I'm still very much going through it, and I will be for the rest of my life.
Yeah, if you're listening to this in 2023 for some bizarre reason, that does not mean enough time has passed and you can ask details.
No. But I will say, if you are going through something hard, no, you still can't ask me details, but you can ask, I don't know, to have a sounding board, or to have a comforting ear, or for advice on how to get through it. Like, I am more than happy to do that. And I'm more than happy to support anybody that is going through hard things, because you can get through it and you are stronger than you know. And weirdly, the most horrifying things that happen to you can truly be blessings. But
one of the greatest gifts you can give to somebody else is the chance to help you.
Yeah.
I can't stress that enough. One of the most powerful experiences of my life has been the privilege of helping through this. I'm not kidding. So if you're dealing with something, I don't care what it is, and it feels insurmountable, it's not. You're not alone. None of us are.
No.
Even when your trauma or your disease is telling you that you are. And there are a hell of a lot of things in this world that want to tell you that you're alone and you can't do it. And that doesn't mean that you're going to do it in the way that you think you will. It doesn't mean that it's going to look the way you think it's going to look.
It never will.
Yeah, it never will. Never does.
But you can and you will recognize that you do have more grace than you thought, that you are stronger than you thought.
More people are on your side than you think.
Yep.
Lots more. That's always been the surprise for me, is when you put out the call to help, for help, which is an incredibly hard thing to do. I don't know anyone who's really put out the call who hasn't gotten back 10x what they expected.
Without a doubt. And I think that's why, that is one of the powers of social media. Yeah, you're going to have that 5% that say stupid things, but the vast majority are going to lend support. So if you are going through something hard, don't be afraid of really reaching out in a public forum, because you'll get support from people that I don't know, you thought barely knew who you were.
I mean, you had people, I think I counted 8 or 10 countries.
Oh yeah.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
And especially this year, especially this world.
Yeah.
You're a huge inspiration to a lot of people because of how you handled this and how you're going to keep handling this. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but we're all here to help.
Yeah.
However we can, even if it is just something as simple as a text message every now and then asking how you're doing.
A silly GIF.
It's remarkable what can be solved with stupid cat GIFs.
Yeah. Yeah.
When in doubt, stupid shit. Always works.
It really does.
And it's just because, look at this. Even though we go from, this has been the pattern the whole pod, is we're crying and then one of us is going to crack a joke. We're both laughing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's look, in hard times, we see the best of humanity. We see the worst of humanity. Find more ways to magnify and capitalize on the best.
And the rest,
there's a lot more of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot more of it. All right. We're going to wrap this episode up. Couple calls to action. Please do us a favor and subscribe, review. But the real call to action here is, 1, if you are dealing with your own trauma, please reach out if we can help. If not to us, reach out to somebody.
Yep.
And 2, if you are not dealing with trauma, reach out to someone in your life who you know is dealing with something, or I'd say who looks like they've got everything together.
Yep.
And ask them how they're doing.
Yep.
Because
one of the best things right now is it doesn't come across as weird to just be like, hey, things have been crazy and hard. How are you?
Yeah.
People are looking for that opening. Give it to them.
Yep. So that's our call to action today.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Other Side of Sales. I promise we'll talk a little more about sales next time. And thank you for going through on this journey with us. And if you sent an encouraging message to Kasey, thank you for doing that.
Yeah. And know that if I didn't respond, it's largely because I was ignoring the other people. So, yeah.
So with that, thank you for listening. We will see you guys next week.